Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up first thing on a Thursday. I really appreciate it. I'm Greg Poling. I direct the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS, and we are very excited to present the results of now about a year of research on the topic of U.S. investment in the Philippines. For those of you who are interested in reading more, the full report that we're going to present the findings of today is going up on our website today. Rather long PDF report, which will be accompanied by a digital report. That'll also be translated into Tagalog. All versions should be up today. So pick your poison, however you'd like to read it. I am just here to do a little housekeeping, then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Jafet Kitson, who was the lead author on this report. First off, I want to thank the State Department's Global Engagement Center for the support that made this report possible. Some of our panelists today will be joining me tomorrow on a flight out to Manila, where we're going to present this thing again on Monday. Slightly different flavor, but we're going to do a dual launch here in Washington and in Manila. As background, the point of this report is kind of twofold. Yes, it is to highlight the scale and the impact of U.S. economic investment over many decades in critical sectors of the Philippine economy. 7 critical sectors that we chose to focus on here, which Jafet will highlight. But the second point is to do so to set the record straight. Because throughout our work on the Philippines, which has been probably 50% of all the work the Southeast Asia Program here does over the last few years, we hear time and time again a false narrative that the U.S. is a minor economic player, that China is the one that drives the Philippine economy. And you can pick almost any statistic other than bilateral goods trade and find that China usually doesn't crack the top 5 in the Philippines. It is U.S. investment, as well as Japanese investment, Korean investment, European investment, that provides high-paying quality jobs for Filipinos. It is not Chinese investment. And so the U.S. often delivers a lot of public goods, but then doesn't tell our story very well. We hope to help a little bit at that part of this, telling the United States story better in order to insulate the broader alliance from the narrative that China is the only thing that matters when it comes to the economy of the Philippines and the wider region. So with that, let me wrap up the introductory remarks, turn over to Jafet to give you the meat of the report, and then we'll turn to 2 fantastic panels. Jafet?
Thank you, Greg. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Jafet Kitson. I'm an associate fellow with our Southeast Asia program. Echoing Greg, I am very excited to be sharing this report with you today. A year work of cool interviews, data collection, and just staring at stats to bring this to you today. We're going to go over some basic stats, going over the narratives that Greg was discussing previously, looking into U.S. government investment in the Philippines, and of course the 7 sectors we focused on for private sector investment. We'll finish up with a couple of recommendations, and we'll send you on your way to our wonderful panelists. Let's get started. So, as Greg mentioned, why are we researching this now? U.S. investment is pretty well documented in terms of quantitative stats. There are significant sources out there that will show you that the United States is among the Philippines' top trading partners, top export destinations, and top FDI investors. But the day-to-day impacts of these investments are often underreported, leaving room for malign foreign actors like China to get in the narrative and claim that the United States isn't carrying its weight, that the United States is a minor actor in the Philippines' greater economic scale, and that it is irrelevant. That is simply not the case. Throughout a lot of our studies, we found that U.S. investment remains a key driver for the Philippine economy and a key source for job growth in the Philippines. Sorry, I was supposed to use the clicker. Let's get into some quick economic stats. Between 2013 and 2024, the United States invested some $3.6 billion into the Philippines and is number 5 in terms of foreign direct investment, just ahead of China and right under Japan. As mentioned previously, it is a top export destination for the Philippines. We're going to look at some key U.S. Philippine economic developments now. Under the Biden and Marcos administration's renaissance of the U.S. Philippine alliance, there have been several critical developments that I'd like to bring up now. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, for instance. The Philippines was one of the U.S.'s 14 IPEF launch partners. The Luzon Economic Corridor allowed for U.S., Philippine, and Japanese cooperation on infrastructure projects on clean energy, semiconductor supply chains, and infrastructure. There was a 1-2-3 agreement signed for nuclear energy cooperation, which will be very important for one of our case studies later. We can also take a look at the Development Finance Corporation's announcement of an intent to open an office in Manila very soon, along with an announcement of $20 million in affordable housing loans. The March 24 Presidential Trade and Investment Mission, led by Secretary Raimondo, was a first-of-its-kind initiative that brought together 22 U.S. business people and their Philippine counterparts to discuss ideas for future collaboration, future partnership, really getting a lot of opportunity to figure out what comes next. And of course, there's EDCA and defense investments. Significant investments have been made in Philippine bases to boost military capacity and boost the infrastructure at these bases. We're also going to take a look now at key private sector investments. There are so many different ways to go for foreign investment into the Philippines. There are over 400 different economic zones with 19 different investment promotion authorities. A lot of them are divided by region or divided by specialty. You can have a tourism-focused investment zone or a industry-focused investment zone. There was even a retirement-focused investment zone. Most export-oriented manufacturing investments go through the Philippine Economic Zone Authority, or PEZA. Today, we're going to highlight 4 of the 7 sectors that we covered in our report, and those 7 sectors were IT-BPM, semiconductors, agriculture, shipping and logistics, renewable energy, defense aerospace, and critical minerals/EVs. Let's go with our first case study, renewable energy. So as many of you know, the Philippines is an archipelagic nation of over 7,000 islands. These 7,000 islands can be very mountainous, and so creating a cohesive electric grid can be very hard to accomplish. Despite accomplishing 97.5% electrification throughout the island, there are still some key challenges. Energy is expensive. Brownouts can be rampant in case of natural disasters. And renewable energy is an excellent source, excellent place for the United States and the Philippines to collaborate, to invest in, because the Philippines is ripe for renewable energy. Close to the equator, it's well equipped for solar power installations with the mountains and the ocean all around. We have excellent opportunities for wind power. And nuclear power, now made possible through the 1-2-3 agreement signed earlier this year, paves the way for small modular reactors, which is actually our first spotlight. NuScale Power, a US-based company, plans to invest $7.5 billion in small modular reactors throughout the Philippines through 2031. These small modular reactors, they're not your traditional nuclear reactor that's large with a giant cooling tank. It can be far more customizable depending on the needs of the community. It can be very small, doesn't require as much maintenance as a mainstream plant. One fueling could potentially power it for 30 years, and maintenance is far easier. The next one we want to spotlight is IT-BPM services. Information technology business process management is a big employer in the Philippines. We're looking at around 1.5 million people employed in the sector as of 2023, with 2.5 million projected by 2028. The Philippines has become a leader in voice IT-BPM services, surpassing India in 2010. Chances are, if you're trying to settle your phone bill for Verizon or T-Mobile, a Filipino will be on the other line. I've definitely taken that to my advantage and used Tagalog. But the increased outsourcing of IT-BPM services is particularly alluring because of the Philippines' young, tech-literate, and largely English-proficient population. Let's take a look at our case study for this one. IT-BPM companies through Accenture or American Express are cited as some of the best places to work in the Philippines, according to Great Place to Work, which is a platform that measures indices such as trust, employee experience, leadership quality, fairness, and employment recognition. The feasibility to work from home and not necessarily in a large, expensive metropolitan center also accentuates the appeal of IT-BPM for Filipino employees. Moving on to our next sector, semiconductors and electronics. As of this presentation, the semiconductor industry employs over 2.5 million Filipinos, and just like with IT-BPM, the Philippines' demographics makes this sector a really compelling area for investment, young, tech literate, and English proficient. The Philippines currently specializes in the assembly, testing, and packaging stage, or ATP phase of the semiconductor value chain, but it hopes to move up in the ranks in the coming years for the lab wafer facility, hopefully in the next 2-3 years. Our spotlight for semiconductors shows the length at which U.S. companies have been investing in the Philippines. Texas Instruments, for instance, has been in the country since 1979. Just recently, in 2023, they announced a $1 billion expansion for the facility expansion in Baguio and Clark City, providing more jobs. Agriculture is the last sector we really want to focus on today. Just like with energy, the Philippine food supply is very sensitive to external shocks. Archipelagic island with very minimal arable land concentrations, most of it in Luzon. And so, securing agricultural productivity and maximizing agricultural productivity is a key priority for the Marcos administration right now. As such, it's an excellent opportunity for investment and collaboration as well. Our spotlight here is a company like Cargill. Cargill, which has been in the Philippines since around 1946, has been investing for a significant period of time. It's partnered with local businesses like Jollibee, opening a joint venture poultry processing facility in 2017 that now employs some 1,200 workers. With a growing middle class and an increasing appetite, processing facilities such as these are going to become increasingly important. We talked a lot about these 4 sectors, but there are also some roadblocks. The Philippines is currently number 6 in terms of foreign direct investment in the ASEAN region. Why is that? A lot of our research found that opaque bureaucracy, perceived difficulty in doing business, expensive power, and expensive labor remain some roadblocks for foreign investors looking into the Philippines, but it is a key priority of the Marcos administration to work on this and boost the country's standing to number 2 in the coming years. There are also some constitutional roadblocks ahead, some of which that have started to be cleared up. In the previous Duterte administration, the Public Services Act now allows, the amendment to the Public Services Act now allows for foreign investment into critical fields like infrastructure or telecommunication, among others. There's talk of more constitutional reform to facilitate a more business-friendly environment in the Philippines, but we're going to have to wait until after the 2025 midterm elections are over to see how that goes. So I promised some recommendations. Our first 3 are very data-centric. I was the one looking behind the glass on a lot of these, at all of the data from 400 some different sources, 19 different IPAs, and they all measure things in very different ways. There's an approved investment and there's a non-approved investment, and it can get very confusing very quickly the longer your Excel sheet becomes. And so creating a comprehensive database of U.S. investment, all collated in one place with one common unit of measure in a central location, would go a long way into finding some clarity with this. This data should be publicized. Private sector and the government should expand their online presence and really celebrate these accomplishments a lot more. A lot of these were found in press releases that didn't have very much traction, whereas there's great opportunity on social media to publicize them and really make it known what these investments are doing for everyday Filipinos. One of our other key recommendations is to continue person-to-person exchanges. We should not let the March 2024 Presidential Trade and Investment Mission be the last one. We should keep it going because these people-to-people exchanges allow for excellent opportunities for new partnerships and new areas for collaboration. Our last recommendation is the diversification of the location of investments in the Philippines to cater to other growing urban centers. Traditionally, most investment has been centralized in Metro Manila and its surrounding areas, but there are so many more different urban centers in the Philippines that we can focus on. One just recently opened up. Davao, for instance, has been under travel advisory for the longest time. It's recently been lifted, and it is a great opportunity for U.S. businesses to come in and find areas to collaborate with their Philippine colleagues. What do we conclude? The U.S.-Philippines economic relationship is strong. Investment remains a significant contributor to new jobs within the Philippines. The United States remains one of the top contributors to foreign direct investment and official development assistance to the Philippines. Contrary to what malign actors may say, it is still a very active and involved participant in the Philippine economy. I'll leave it for there. I gave you a 10,000 feet from the air view of U.S. investments in the Philippines. Our subsequent two panels will give you a little closer look into specific segments, specific sectors, and the general state of the relationship. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you for coming today.
All right. Thank you very much, Jafet. Hi, everybody. I'm back. Greg Poling again. I'm going to be moderating our first of two panels today. This is going to be more of the general overview of the U.S. Philippine economic relationship, and then in the second panel, we'll dig into some of the specific sectors highlighted in the report. We have three fantastic panelists today. We did not plan in advance which order they're going to go in, so I'm just going to make Erin go first because she happened to sit next to me. Let me introduce each of them in turn, and then I'll turn it over. So Erin Murphy is the Deputy Director and a Senior Fellow for our newly created CSIS Chair on India and Emerging Asia Economics. She was previously the Director for the Indo-Pacific at the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, also worked at the CIA and ran her own boutique advisory firm in Myanmar for years. Then we'll hear from Hank Hendrickson. Hank helped launch the U.S. Philippine Society here in Washington in 2012. He continues to serve as its executive director. He was a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with postings across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, including two postings in the Philippines. And then we'll hear from our old friend Dindo Manhit. Dindo unfortunately couldn't make the trip, although I look forward to seeing him in person at our next launch event on Monday. Dindo is the founder and president of the Strat-Base Group and the Strat-Base ADR Institute in Manila. He's also the Philippine country head of Bauer Group Asia and serves as the chair of the Strategic Communications and Cybersecurity Committee of the Armed Forces of the Philippines Multi-Sector Governance Council. I apologize, Dindo, I had to look down to get that last one correct. All right, so with that, let me turn over to Erin for our first set of opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Greg, and congratulations on the release of the report. I will also be on a plane to Manila. It will be my first time in the Philippines, oddly, considering how long I've been working in Southeast Asia. And so it will be great to actually see a lot of the work that I've been doing here in Washington actually come to fruition in the Philippines. And so just to talk a little bit about the economic relationship, I'll take it more from the development finance side of things and how the DFC and other government agencies try to promote private sector investment and mobilize capital into other countries. But I think, one of the things that this report is trying to do is to show that the U.S. is investing in the Philippines, that it is a top export and import destination, that the relationship is strong. So usually when things are going well, you don't think about who is doing it well. When things go poorly, that's when you try to figure out who's doing the wrong thing. So the U.S., unfortunately, is doing things well, because you don't hear a lot of complaints about what they're doing or waving the flag in terms of what sort of investments that they're supporting. Also, the U.S. is horrific at, well, maybe horrific is a really strong word, but is not very good at promoting the sort of things that it does do. Press releases, summits, trilateral summits, visits, it really only appeals to the wonkier type. So here in Washington, of course, we know exactly what's happening in Manila and Tokyo. So it doesn't really get out to the broader audience, and you don't necessarily want to slap your logo on everything, but hopefully reports like this do demonstrate what the U.S. is doing, what the Philippines is doing as well to try to drive this investment. I think perhaps one of the flashier announcements that's happened in the last year, and this year and 2023, there's certainly been quite a lot of them, is the Luzon corridor. And this is part and parcel of the G7's efforts to counter BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, but to also kind of demonstrate what it and its partners can do in terms of critical infrastructure. The Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment is really trying to drive infrastructure investments in a wide range of sectors, and ones that you don't think that are traditionally infrastructure as well. That includes healthcare, supporting women-owned businesses and small, medium-sized enterprises. It also includes major infrastructure, both physical infrastructure like ports, railroads, airports, all sorts of things that we tend to use, and digital infrastructure as well. That's competitive, but it's also an attempt to show that there's an alternative to Chinese investment, not that all of it is bad, but that there is an alternative to that type of investment. It can be high quality, it can be transparent, it can be trustworthy. So the Luzon corridor is trying to address a lot of that. This is also part of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is another way for the United States to show its economic commitment to the region. There's a lot of skepticism about it. There's also a lot of questions about whether or not IPEF will continue after the November election. We're not going to talk about that today. Maybe in the Q&A, but honestly, I left my crystal ball upstairs, so I can't really make too many predictions about that. But bringing IPEF together with the G7's PGI is manifesting itself in the Luzon corridor, which is not only looking to link several cities together with transportation infrastructure, but also to deal with the critical issues that this report highlighted, including on agriculture, where food security is certainly an issue. So this will help address that issue through linkages, cold storage facilities, which is really a problem not just in the Philippines, but Southeast Asia writ large, and help address some of those food securities, both for the Philippines, but also for its ability to export abroad. It's also, I think, reflecting one of the key pillars of both IPEF and PGI in terms of clean energy. The Philippines has encountered some energy insecurity. This goes some ways to address that issue, and whether it's SMR technology, wind, solar, geothermal, I think that the investments in this corridor will help demonstrate either at least through pilot projects, but also as proof of concept in terms of how to expand those types of investments overseas. But then there's also semiconductors. Everyone's talking about chips. The Philippines plays a specific role in that. Everyone's also talking about supply chain diversification. We all became experts during COVID. And now we're kind of seeing this come to fruition. So the Philippines plays a critical role in the U.S., but also for the Philippines as well in their national security and foreign policy priorities. And now that we're seeing that economic security is also very much intertwined with that. It's not a silo anymore. It's not just talking about trade or tariffs or sanctions or how we build up our import and exports. It is part of national security. So these types of investments will show that. I think for the DFC, my work alma mater, I saw this firsthand, that the Philippines was really a place, even before the announcement of PGI or IPEF, that the Philippines was really a place where the DFC wanted to focus because it saw the opportunities. And I think with Duterte's moves on amending the Public Services Act, this really opened up a lot of opportunities. So for the DFC, its main effort is to mobilize private sector investment. What it seeks to do is to invest solely with the private sector In its transition from OPIC to DFC, it can now invest in local businesses. So this is a boon for Philippines business as well. When it was OPIC, there had to be some sort of American flavor to an investment, but now it can really be any sort of investor in the Philippines. The DFC is looking to open an office in Manila. I think that this is going to be a great way to push the Luzon corridor, but to push other investments as well. As of now, the DFC has about $92 million worth of investments. A lot of that came out of the last year. Japhet helped highlight what some of those investments are, but hopefully this is just the step to going further. Some of these are legacy investments from the 1980s. They're still going on, so that I think also demonstrates where the U.S. is on this. But these investments so far have culminated in investments in agriculture and ag tech, SME financing, and affordable housing. But I think that the DFC, as well as the U.S. government in general, is really looking to support investments in semiconductors and the energy sector as well, particularly on renewable energy. I'll stop there because I'm sure there's lots of questions, and I'd also like to hear from our other panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. All right, Hank, over to you.
Well, thank you, Greg, and it's very nice to be part of this important discussion on the impact of U.S. investment in key sectors of the Philippine economy. Thank you, Aaron, and Japhet for your really interesting presentations. CSIS and the U.S. Philippine Society enjoy a longstanding partnership. We expect to continue and even expand in the year ahead. The U.S. Philippine Society was launched in 2012 at a time when changing global conditions drew renewed attention by official Washington to developments in the Indo-Pacific. Some called it the pivot to Asia or a rebalancing of U.S. policy priorities. Our thinking at the time, conceptualized by Ambassador Tom Hubbard, who's with us today, along with several Filipino government and private sector leaders, was that in view of the historic ties, shared values, and interests linking our two countries, the United States and the Philippines should be logical partners in the rebalance. As many of you know, the Society is an independent, binational, nonprofit organization with a vision for the relationship that is broad-based, resting on pillars of strategic engagement, economic cooperation, and people-to-people ties. So congratulations to Greg and Japhet on their report. We agree fully that while bilateral economic cooperation may be well documented, the impact is not fully appreciated or properly understood. Indeed, there is more than meets the eye in terms of U.S. investment impact. But let's also bear in mind, going forward, that even more is possible. Your report made an important observation that marginalizing or underreporting the positive impact of American investments can open the door for malign actors to promote false or harmful narratives that can weaken broader public support for the alliance relationship. Strategic U.S. engagement with the Philippines has intensified significantly over the past 2 years in response to regional challenges. Public audiences around the world, including in the Philippines and America, have seen live action reporting on confrontations on the high seas aimed at constraining assertions of Philippine sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea and the resupply of outposts in Manila's exclusive economic zone. These images, a result of transparency initiatives by Philippine authorities and good work by Greg and others, together with heightened tensions surrounding Taiwan, have focused the public on mutual security concerns that could risk diverting attention from broader elements in the relationship, including sustained and mutually beneficial economic ties. As the report points out, active measures are underway to manipulate public opinion through disinformation regarding the defense commitment to Philippine forces in the South China Sea and U.S. Philippine cooperation more broadly. But here with this report, we have an opportunity to call attention objectively through sound research and analysis to a positive picture, ways in which significant U.S. investment is delivering wide-ranging benefits. Timing is important here, not only in response to regional tensions, but in light of the upcoming U.S. election and the period of transition and policy review that normally follows an election, regardless of who wins. The findings of this report illustrate how policies of engagement can be a win-win for the alliance relationship and help sustain policy continuity in Washington. And we should bear in mind that election season will also be approaching in the Philippines. For those factions supporting deepened engagement with the United States and looking for a payoff beyond the advantages of tighter defense cooperation, this report serves as a reminder that deeper engagement can deliver economic dividends as well as security benefits. A few other observations. First, in addressing the role of governments in contributing to the investment climate, the report does an excellent job of outlining the role of U.S. government initiatives along with multilateral cooperation in the context of trilateral ties with Japan. The announcement last spring of U.S.-Japan-Philippines engagement on the Luzon Economic Corridor, which aims to promote connectivity between Subic Bay, Clark, Manila, and Batangas, is an important example. Other examples, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, Aaron mentioned, will provide loans for affordable housing and other things, and have an office in Manila for the first time. USAID has invested $5 billion over the past 60 years and continues to be involved. In that connection, USAID implementing partner URC, a member of the U.S. Philippine Society, was recently awarded a new $37 million TB project to improve community health in the Philippines. Another linkage, an important one. The Millennium Challenge Corporation recently begun talks about restarting threshold programs. In addition to these channels of economic engagement, security-related assistance under U.S. foreign military financing has expanded significantly, as the report points out. And the reference to the EDCA sites is important because the work that's going in to upgrade infrastructure at these sites will have downstream benefits for regional centers in the Philippines that are looking to expand and improve air and sea connectivity. Important in a country, it was pointed out, that is an archipelago and is looking to expand regional connectivity beyond the Metro Manila and Cebu areas. A second observation relates to private non-government organizations. The report documents the central role of business and key USG agencies, but organizations like the U.S. Philippine Society, the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, the American Chamber of Commerce, that can complement and facilitate American investment. For example, as our co-chair, Society co-chair, Jaime Augusto Zabel, recently hosted a visit to Manila by J.P. Morgan Chase Chairman Jamie Dimon, and that reflects the importance of growing financial and business ties between our two countries. The U.S. Philippine Society has also helped introduce strategic staffing solutions, a global technology recruiter, and Versar Global on Climate and Resilience to the Philippines. Luterio Thomas, LLC, an architecture and engineering firm on our board of directors, is expanding operations in the Philippines, just to name a few. A third observation, or recommendation for investors, is to look at how the Philippine government identifies priorities. Starting at the top, we have met with, we have met with President Marcos at key points over a period of more than 2 years, including in New York in 2022, in Manila in 2023 and 24, in Washington in May 2023 and April of this year. The President's message has been consistent, stressing that he cannot envision a future for the Philippines without a strong partnership with the United States. He's also made clear that that partnership should rest fundamentally on strong economic ties. Members of his cabinet, leaders of his economic team, Philippine Ambassador Babe Romualdez here in Washington, has similarly stressed the central importance of business and investment relations. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, his role as the keynoter at the welcome dinner we hosted for President Marcos last April, just after she led the U.S. Presidential Trade and Investment Mission to the Philippines in March, was a clear signal of American responsiveness to top Philippine priorities. President Marcos identified a wide range of areas ripe for cooperation, stretching even beyond the sectors addressed here today in the CSIS report. He urged Americans to consider doing business with the Philippines in areas of decarbonization, telecommunications, healthcare, critical green minerals, and to become a strategic partner in terms of metal processing for American battery application and development. He also made a pitch for technical cooperation in science, medicine, AI, and in meeting environmental challenges, among others. A recurring theme of the Marcos administration, which assumed office during the pandemic, is that it's not enough for the Philippines to restore its pre-COVID economy, but rather to chart new courses toward competitiveness focused on the future. A fourth point relates to the need for potential American investors to gain a better understanding of both the potential and the challenges facing the Philippine economy as seen through the lenses of Filipino private sector leaders and academic analysts. Look, for example, at the importance of demographic trends as related to labor supply. Look at education standards, social services, governance, and fiscal policy. What are the drivers of growth? What are the new drivers, especially? And the continuing impact of remittances, for example, from overseas workers, the future of the BPO sector, which will change, opportunities to expand the tourism industry and take advantage of supply chain diversification. There's solid analysis on many of these issues available from international sources, drawing on some of the research we're talking about here today. But the insider's view from Filipino analytical sources conveys a unique feel and has special value. A final observation returns to the point that while there is more than meets the eye in the U.S. Philippines investment relationship, clearly more is possible that can yield new dividends for both Philippines and the United States. The key point here is that a fresh approach on trade and investment policy can have enormous benefits. With the onset of a new administration in Washington, the U.S. could and should show renewed leadership on multilateral trade in the Indo-Pacific. If there is a political preference for bilateral approaches, the next administration should explore discussions of a free trade agreement with the Philippines. For its part, the Philippines should continue to look for ways to shape policies and regulatory and legal frameworks to lure trade and investment partners. A Philippine FTA would benefit American exporters looking at a large and expanding market in a country growing both by population, now more than 110 million, and GDP. For example, U.S. agricultural producers would be better able to compete for market access for dairy products and grains and others. And an FTA would level the playing field with exporters from other countries that already benefit from free trade arrangements with the Philippines. A Philippine FTA would put policy-level heft behind existing initiatives outlined today to promote trade and investment and lead to the point where the benefits would be evident and it may not be necessary any longer to say there's more than meets the eye. U.S. negotiators will find that opening more opportunities for American business in the Philippines is consistent with Philippine government initiatives as Manila continues to pursue FTAs with global trading partners in order to diversify and increase foreign investment. Just as examples, the Philippines ratified an FTA with South Korea a month ago, has renewed trade negotiations with the EU, and is reportedly in the process of negotiating an FTA with the UAE. In closing, to underline our central message, kudos for the great work on the CSIS report, but along with those kudos, hope that your findings about the underreported impact of existing investments will spur progress toward new and expanded policy-driven U.S.-Philippines trade and investment relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Hank. And now let me turn to Dindo, who deserves a special thank you for joining us at what is now 10:12 p.m. in Manila. Dindo, over to you.
Hi, Greg. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and of course, good evening from Manila. Thank you for this opportunity to be part of this panel, and allow me to add to the argument of the study done by Japet and Greg on U.S. investment in the Philippines. Especially during the previous government, we tried to argue against some of the narratives that they tried to push at the time. In StatBase, we have tried to push deeper analysis from both geopolitical and geoeconomics. So what we have done through the years is really we saw what the confluence of what we call national security and economics as it intensifies trade and investment in the region. And the Philippines, really, if you would look at it from a geopolitical analysis in the Indo-Pacific, what we really see is, and there is a lack of appreciation even in the Philippines, that we are in the middle of the Indo-Pacific, and in this Indo-Pacific region, we have to take note of how our sea lanes, the West Philippine Sea or even in the Philippine Rise on the eastern side, really is important to trade between different continents of the world, and even how as we push for movements of data, how key submarine cables passes through the archipelago of the Philippines. Given that as a backdrop, really the challenge for the Philippines is as we try to sustain our growth, driven heavily by the service sector, is how can we spur investment in the manufacturing sector that can really create jobs. We've seen high underemployment in the Philippines. We continue to be seen as one that can contribute to strong economic growth for the region, but it's really about investments or even the growth of our export sector. And what we have seen is really where the narrative, especially for the previous administration, referring to the 2016-2022 administration of Duterte, tried to top of the narrative of how important China is as a trading partner. But in strat-based, we have argued at the height of that administration that when you see this data, we see something different. There's heavy trade deficit between China and the Philippines. And the U.S., we have good trade relationship with you. That's why we consider it as trade, your beneficial trade partner of the Philippines. More so if you look at investments. In the interest of time, I'll just use our 2022 data. When you see Japan, it's not really Singapore that is second, especially when you understand corporate movements in Southeast Asia. Singapore investments are actually either American or U.S. companies who has regional offices in Singapore, or European Union or EU companies. So it's possible that the United States is actually our second biggest source of foreign direct investment. And I really wanted to emphasize that after 6 years of appeasing China, the Philippines simply had 0.92% of our investment directly from China. And if I would have added the 2023 data to my discussion, I think it even went down to 0.22. And I remember what our own president in CSIS, when he visited in May 2023, really spoke of economic security. It's national security. And I have echoed that in the Philippines through our different activities and initiatives, but more so in our regular surveys that we run nationally in the Philippines quarterly for the past 2 decades. Especially when you speak of the 80% support of Filipinos that we need to form alliances and strengthen relationship with countries that have similar beliefs with the Philippines, especially in helping us defend our territorial and economic rights. And during last year also, we even said, who should we strengthen our economic relationships with? In the survey done by our partner, Pulse Asia, for us, we see the United States. And it's basically the narrative that we kept on pushing. There's noise, but the noise coming from countries or groups supported by our northern neighbor does not really penetrate. Especially when you see that only 19% of Filipinos really believe that China is a good economic partner of the Philippines. Fast forward to 2024, when we just finished the survey just a month ago, whereby the United States is seen as the most beneficial economic partner of the Philippines, followed by partners and allies of the United States, as they work together. Japan, Australia, Canada is seen as a strong partner. And when we speak of a trusted partner for Philippines as we move towards and aspire for national development, you would see again the United States on top of that, and with China simply 1% of Filipinos believing that they can be a trusted partner for national development. And it's good that Hank pointed out the importance of the private sector earlier, because the private sector is seen as one that can really improve the livelihood opportunities of Filipinos. You see that in our yearly survey on this topic, and also how they can generate and produce affordable and accessible goods for Filipinos and create high quality jobs and improve even healthcare. You know, in the Philippines, a key concern of Filipinos is always economics. Cost of living can only be addressed by job opportunities or livelihood opportunities that provide them with good income. And right now, when I saw the brief on the study done by Japet and Greg, really, the sectors that they identified with is also the sectors that in our conversations and discussions with our own board of investment, they asked us to analyze where we can grow. We kept on talking about how important the Philippines is from a geostrategic location and the relationship that it brings, especially not only with the U.S., but even with the push of the G7 countries to have stronger engagement in the Philippines. And also, we have to take note of the abundant critical natural resources that we have in the Philippines. Green metals, as we would say, and also we have very young workforce and a young population. So we are a market that could be tapped by countries, especially when we have a median age of 25 and over 110, 115 million plus consumer base. And we see the sectors, as we see reports from our own board of investment, as possible growth area that we can see. And we believe that the United States has taken a lead in some of these areas already, can take a lead more as we move forward and really see stronger investments coming from the U.S. I've done work not only as a researcher, but also done work in shepherding some of the growth of companies coming from the United States, especially with my work with Bauer Group Asia, and even with the consulting side of at Stratbase. So we Filipinos tend to value American brands and American companies in the country. And I've long argued that, as the Philippines within this region navigate this complex geostrategic landscape, as we see de-risking, diversifying, and some would even say deglobalization, what we see should not be threats to the country, but geoeconomic opportunities. But it takes what I call in the Philippines a whole of Philippine society approach, where the government creates the environment for investments to grow through improvements in governance, where the private sector partners with government, help generate a more open economy, and create investment-led job-generating growth. But key to that really is the international community. The Philippines is really a very open society, and we value friends like the United States who've been with us, especially data supports that you've been with us in terms of investments, trade, and also generating people-to-people engagement. So thank you again for this opportunity to share these thoughts from Manila, and hoping to share it again next week.
Thank you so much, Dindo. So we now have time for audience Q&A, both for those in the room and those watching online. If you'd like to ask a question here in the room, we have a microphone in the back. For those online, you can type your questions in and we'll see them here. If I can go ahead and start us off. Let me start with Aaron. You were head of Indo-Pacific for the DFC at a time when I think U.S. attention was just beginning to turn more toward the Philippines after decades of a bit of high-level neglect. Over the last decade, Philippine GDP has doubled. The Philippines is projected by the World Bank to have the second fastest growth in Southeast Asia for the foreseeable future. And the economy has really opened, first after a decade of sound macroeconomic policy from the Aquino administration on, and then with the important reforms to the Public Service Act and the Retail Services Act at the end of the Duterte administration. But it feels like U.S. companies have been slow to realize that, to kind of shake off maybe long-standing perceptions that the Philippines was less attractive as a source for investments than, say, Vietnam and Indonesia. Can you speak a little bit to whether and how quickly you think that has shifted and what role the U.S. government has played in helping to nudge corporate interest?
Sure. The private sector, I think, get a reputation being, moving fast and breaking things, but that's really more on the Silicon Valley side, and think about where they're investing. It's mostly in tech, and it's mostly in their backyard. To get U.S. investors to think about going overseas, they're incredibly risk averse. They want to save money, make money, and whatnot, and so it really takes them a long time to get nudged along. Part of what the DFC and the U.S. government's role in kind of highlighting these new markets is that by investing in these markets, they're trying to send a signal to the private sector that this is a good place to go. Because if you think the private sector is risk averse, the U.S. government is even more so. The DFC and other U.S. agencies have been driven by this ethos that has been around since the Reagan administration of never losing a taxpayer dollar. And so what the DFC, USAID, MCC are doing is investing taxpayer dollars, and the last thing they want to do is to explain to Congress that they lost money on investments. So when you see agencies like the DFC go in, actively look for projects that are going to meet its standards, but also demonstrate that this is a market to go into, I think that should be a signal for the private sector. How long that takes, I think it depends. Obviously politics here also influence things. The private sector will have a big question as to whether the U.S. will still provide some political cover, if you will, or the financial support in going forward. But I think regardless, there are things in place that are going to continue despite who wins in November. The CHIPS Act, IRA, that's law. It's going to take a lot to undo that, and I don't really see that happening anytime soon. But there's also a recognition in both parties here in the United States that the supply chain issue is one that kind of transcends politics, and that we all have a role to play in making sure that it's a safe and trusted supply chain, that it continues going despite any choke points. And so the Philippines are really a big part of that, especially on semiconductors, but also in terms of tech and the other industries that this report highlighted. So it may take a little bit, but you usually don't start seeing the numbers come out. This is the really annoying thing about economics, is that any type of data that you see, it usually comes for a couple of years ago. And we're like, look, it's so recent. Well, it's like 2022, and it's really hard to kind of also see the post-COVID sort of boom. But I think that, when we look at the data, we'll get numbers going forward, but I think, the time is right. The U.S. has definitely signaled that this is a place to go, so hopefully we'll start seeing that in a more tangible way.
Hank, you were posting the Philippines in the early 80s, right, as it was garnering the, reputation among U.S. and Western businesses of being a rough place to invest. And then in the 90s, when it was still trying to dig out from under that. Now, from your perch at U.S. Phil Society, how are you seeing the shift in attention of U.S. companies?
I think, Greg, in a larger sense, those of us who have worked in and with the Philippines for some decades, it's been up and down for the Philippines, clearly. And by sort of not coincidentally, that we started the U.S. Philippine Society in 2012 at a time when the trajectories were very good, both in terms of economic growth, political transition, stability, and all these factors come to bear on confidence in markets. And so I think right now we're in a very good place, especially because the leadership in Manila and the leadership here in Washington have found common interest, and part of it, this going back to the theme of today's discussion, is that the underreported story is on the economic, trade, and investment side, and that more can be done. And I might just add that, when we talked about sustaining these the visits and the importance of personal ties between the two countries, this presidential trade and investment mission that took Secretary Raimondo there, we don't have to have big trade missions to have high-level contacts. I mean, the Secretary of Commerce can go and could go in other capacities. Congressional delegations should continue to go. We've had how many visits from Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, the Vice President, and these are really important things, welcomed and reciprocated by visits from top Philippine security, and importantly, the economic team are here too. So we would advocate to keep those discussions going, because that can lay the groundwork for policy improvements in policies that could bring us together on sort of trade, the trade issues that I talked about earlier. Yeah.
Dindo, anything to add from Manila on how the Philippine government has kind of recreated its image among foreign investors?
I think very important to realize that, and a lot of people are surprised when I say this to this administration, is that when he brought his team, President Marcos brought his cabinet, appointed members of the cabinet, and really drove this culture that they will be private sector friendly. And being part of private sector friendly, we saw this early on in his administration, even more so foreign private sector friendly. And key to that is I think their analysis that for the Philippines to sustain our growth, consumption is not enough. We really need to cross that line of an investment-led growth, stronger in the service sector, but better growing in the manufacturing sector, and hopefully our own agricultural sector can keep up with it. And key to that is the private sector. And since they had that opportunity, of course, we hear it being credited to the Duterte administration, the Public Service Act, and the Foreign Investment Act. But for Filipinos like me, it's a struggle for years, even decades, to have these laws. It's just that it was passed during the time. And I give credit to the leadership of both houses of Congress, not only the President Duterte at that time, because the better version came out of the Senate, which was not the version of the Duterte government, which really opened up and even protected the Philippines, especially the Public Service Act, especially critical infrastructure. But because of these foundations that has been laid down, we've seen this government really engage and encourage investment from the foreign community, and even encourage private sector to continuously engage directly with our own president through he institutionalized what early on, I think first quarter of his administration, the Private Sector Advisory Council. And we see this, data has not been published, but in my conversation with the Board of Investments, we are on an all-time high in terms of investments this year, 2024. But of course, from approval of investment, it will take some time for actual investments to come in. So we might see really strong foreign investments towards the last 2 years of this administration. And there's really this big hope that programs, initiatives like the Luzon Corridor, or even initiatives coming from EU engagements here in the country will really drive investment and really strengthen the belief in the Philippines that as we build our national security with like-minded partners that share our values, we will also build our economic security. And really your study, Greg and Japet, will be very helpful in educating the Filipino community that is strongly supportive of more U.S. investment in the country with data that we can use to push really for more support at the different levels of government for U.S. investment.
Thanks, Dindo. All right, let's take our first question from the floor. Leslie?
Appreciate that, Greg. So Leslie Wilhelm, U.S. Navy. Really, really appreciate the panel discussion. Incredibly interesting. So I think one of my key question is, my observation in the Philippines is that in many key sectors, energy being one of the top ones that comes to mind, that often there are sort of key Philippine entities that control the sector, making it difficult for foreign investors to make headway in. And so my question is, are each of your organizations working with foreign investing companies, particularly U.S. companies, to mesh with Philippine companies to try to sort of segue into some of those investments? And if so, how well is this working?
Thanks. Dindo, you mind if I start with you, and we'll go in reverse order
Yes.
this time?
Of course, with the Philippines, there is that misconception that it's controlled by a few companies or corporations. But as you dig deep into these companies that are players in the energy space, even in the energy space, they have a lot of partners from foreign, and their own capital support is coming from foreign investors also. So it's also key to understand the dynamics within these companies and how it really brings together not only Philippines, maybe they're the majority, but as you break it down, you'll see some foreign partners along the way, or even private equity firms in the Philippines who have invested heavily, or even funds coming from Canada or funds coming from Singapore, sovereign wealth funds who are heavily invested in some of our holding companies of this energy. And in the Philippines, we have really long, especially in the oil and gas space, really have always wanted the U.S. Brands in the U.S. to really take the Philippines and its natural wealth, especially in the possibly natural gas space, to work with the Philippines. So we're actually, I think by 2 weeks from now, there might be a law that will pass that will encourage more investment in natural gas exploration in the Philippines. So you see that happening, and it's good to engage with these companies more and see how there will be mutual benefit between Filipino companies and American companies, not only the energy space, but even the infrastructure space.
Thanks. Hank or Aaron?
Just quickly, I think the larger point here is that the Philippines, as a growing economy and growing population, really needs energy, and they need a lot of it as the middle class grows and people want cars and refrigerators and air conditioning and all this kind of thing. So the challenge is how to provide that, and there's clearly a role for American companies in that. You have also the challenges that were outlined earlier, talked about with the grid in an archipelagic country, expanding that, and there are ways to go about approaching that. Anyway, we've got people here today who represent an American company that's done an MOU with a Philippine energy company on LNG. So there are examples of cooperation. So the door is open for this kind of thing. Should it be open further, and should more be done? I think the appetite is clearly there in the Philippines for this kind of thing, and a role for American business in that.
All right. Let's take our first question online from Amber M. at the State Department. How do you anticipate the Luzon Economic Corridor and the new Create More law affecting the investment environment and interest in FDI? Maybe I'll be nice and just ask Aaron about the Luzon Economic Corridor, not the Create More Act, because I don't remember what the acronym stands for. I'm pretty sure the C is corporate and the T is tax, but go ahead.
Yeah, considering that we live in acronym land, it's very easy to forget this. It took me about 2 years to remember what the BUILD Act stood for, and that's what created the DFC. The Luzon corridor has a lot of potential, and so what it will take is ongoing interest, not just interest, but investment and accountability to make sure that it meets its milestones. I would say of the economic corridors that have been announced, I think the Luzon corridor has probably the greatest chance of success. And part of that is because of the relationship between the U.S. and the Philippines, but also the relationship between the Philippines and Japan, two of its biggest partners in making sure this gets through. Again, I'll emphasize the fact that the Philippines is really, I think, emblematic of how the U.S. and Japan view economic security when it is wrapped up in national security. And of course, we've seen the quote as well from President Marcos on how economic security is now national security. The idea of these economic corridors is that it's not just, building the transportation links and trying to ease big issues, whether it's, transportation in general, but also transporting food and goods, but also it's the communities of business that come up around it. And I think that we've seen that happen, in other projects like this or efforts to have special economic zones. This is like a special economic zone on steroids, and that it is spanning quite a long ways. So it's not just kind of the manufacturing zones that have to pop up on these, whether it's on the semiconductor industry or on the ag and ag tech side of things, especially when it comes around cold storage and warehousing facilities, but also the industries that support the workers that are going to be there, whether it's the restaurants or shopping malls, hotels, housing. DFC is already putting investment into affordable housing. You can only expect that to grow. So, I think it's one of those, if you build it, they will come. So I think that there's a lot of opportunities for jobs in a variety of sectors that aren't just coming from the specificity of what the Luzon corridor is meant to do. Sure, there are going to be jobs in building railroads and in upgrading port facilities and, helping build roads, but also for the retail and the consumer goods that come around that. So, I do see a lot of opportunities. It's also helpful that some of this infrastructure is already there and just needs to be upgraded. That really, I think, goes a long way instead of building it from scratch. So infrastructure, though, I will warn, takes a long time. So there has to be a bit of patience as well. But it behooves us that are monitoring this to kind of keep up to see where that progress is happening and where it isn't. So I'm sure CSIS will be on top of that. Greg and I will be on top of that, but also for all of you as well.
Thanks. Hank, any thoughts on the Luzon Economic Corridor? No? All right. Dindo, can I put you on the spot to explain to the DC audience what the Create More Act is?
The Create More Act is really an amendment to one of our tax reform bills that really encourages corporations, both domestic and foreign, to invest more. And a little background on this was that what drove this, the legislative discussions or debate started exactly this time last year, was when former Prime Minister Kishida had a meeting with President Marcos. I think one of the message, even though the meeting was supposed to be limited to security issues, one of the key concerns of Japanese investors, and that's why there was a holdback on the interest, even though they value a lot of success stories in the Philippines, especially in the manufacturing space, was really the ease of paying taxes, especially on value-added taxes. So the Create More was meant to address some of these locators coming from Japan and now, of course, even America, the United States. So the idea here is how can we make it easier for these investors as they deal with some of their tax challenges in the Philippines. So this will be signed into law, I think by November 11th. So again, this is one of those initiatives by this government to make it more business friendly and hopefully generates more interest in investment in the Philippines.
Thank you. All right. Next question from the floor.
Thanks to all the panelists for this wonderful panel. My question is also kind of related with the Luzon Economic Corridor. I'm particularly curious about the Philippines' perspective on how the country is now kind of navigating the uncertainty or possible impacts the U.S. election results could cause to the U.S. Philippines economic cooperation under the IPEF, and particularly on the Luzon Economic Corridor. I mean, if the former president returns to the White House. Thanks.
You did say it was going to come up in Q&A, Aaron.
And she did ask about the Filipino perspective, so I'm also going to throw it back to our man in Manila. President Trump has said very clearly that he's going to tear up IPEF. It's worse than TPP. It's TPP2. Clearly he hasn't read what IPEF is because it doesn't have market access. And, a lot of the criticisms around IPEF also, I think, demonstrates also from Congress where perhaps not all of it has been read through. But, there are, most of the focus is on Pillar 1, which is around fair trade, digital trade. And, that's still something I think the U.S. is working through, even though digital trade is part of the 21st Century Taiwan-U.S. Act and also USMCA. And I think that we're going to kind of see more of the same if Harris wins. IPEF will continue. We'll see if there's any progress on Pillar 1. And that I think you would still see the efforts in the G7 continue as well. PGI, where they're going to come up with the money to fund some of the PGI projects is a big question for any administration. And, I think that there's still a lot of concern about where is that's coming from. And the answers that I see seem to be focused on, well, it's going to come from the private sector, so I guess it's on you. But there might be pieces of the IPEF that do continue that are certainly popular, I think, with both parties that could survive. So perhaps you could convince Trump not throwing out the entire thing, but keeping some parts of it, like the supply chain mechanisms that have been put through, a lot of effort on labor, and transparency around taxes and anti-corruption. These are all things that are good for U.S. businesses. It's also great for Philippines businesses and for FDI as well. So I think that there might be some way to try to convince Trump that these are all good things. Again, under Harris, I think that a lot of this is going to continue. But from the Philippine perspective, I certainly can't do that. So I would turn it over to our other panelists.
And the first Trump administration was also going to tear up APEC, and it just got renamed USMCA with a few amendments.
There you go, the worst trade.
Dindo, your thoughts from Manila?
Of course, there's really so much interest on the part of the Philippines or Filipinos themselves on this Luzon corridor. But I think the way to deal with risk of political change or political policy uncertainty with political change is really private sector. And in the Philippines, that's why I think one of the things that you have seen with this government is really how they relied on public-private partnership. And there's still a lot of interest on some of these infrastructure initiatives. And we have seen even Japanese ODA being used with, after a while, the next step is a public-private partnership in terms of operating or maintaining some of this infrastructure. So there could be models that can evolve depending on the policy direction if there are changes in the United States. But right now, I think what we need in the Philippines is really how private companies can take note of the Philippines and invest in the infrastructure space, in the energy space, in the renewable energy space, to be more specific even. And I think that will address any uncertainty of policy. If they see the market is good enough, just like how some companies are seeing it, and how some or more American companies through the years or through the centuries, as I would say, because those have stayed on, have seen opportunities in the Philippines, then this uncertainty can be addressed, even with policy or leadership change in Washington.
Thank you. We have just 4 minutes left in this panel, so let me take both of the last two questions from the floor, and then we'll let the panelists give their closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'd like to commend the presenter for an excellent presentation. My name is Jean Calonge, a retired Philippine ambassador. My question is, one of the principles enunciated there was the development of the various parts of the country. And if we concentrate on Luzon as a corridor, it's like developing New York City. Everybody knows Luzon. Luzon will naturally grow because of its strengths. Why don't we have a a corridor in the places that are not heard in the United States, like Mindoro, Masbate, Leyte. Leyte is very significant to the U.S. Because of the liberation, so-called liberation of the country started there. Or northern Mindanao. There are safe, very safe places in northern Mindanao. Surigao, General Santos City, further south. I think it's better to have a holistic approach towards the geography of the country rather than concentrating on Luzon. Thank you.
And our next question? Did we have another question? Oh, just standing in the back of the room. All right. Well, then that makes it easy. We have 2 minutes. So shouldn't we invest outside of Luzon?
Of course. But as I was saying, the risk aversion, when you're trying to attract foreign direct investors, when you're trying to attract foreign investment in U.S. investors, you sort of have to give them a taste of what they're going. So Luzon, yes, that's a gateway into the rest of the Philippines. But what that does is present opportunities, a proof of concept that this is possible. And then, I think in terms of being in the Philippines itself, like taking them on the trade missions to other places to show what the opportunities are. Once you have them there, it's much easier to go forward. So yes, of course, go beyond Luzon.
Hank, any thoughts?
Well, I would only mention that maybe a couple of points here. One is that the areas that we're talking about with the Luzon Economic Corridor connect Subic and Clark, which are two, areas that Americans are very familiar with. So there's an attraction there for, looking at it in the context of former bases into the, transforming into commercial manufacturing sites of importance. And it's a really good story. I mean, there are 4 times more people working at Clark and Subic now, Filipino employees, than there were at the height of the bases, which were big employers back in the Cold War period. So that's one thing. There's an attractiveness to weaving these facilities, these areas, into the mainstream of Philippine production in some areas, and the infrastructure. And there is a need. It's not, you talk about, Ambassador, doing something around New York City, the infrastructure there is developed. There's a lot of room for increased development linkages with Batangas through Manila and beyond Manila, frankly. So, those are, areas of importance to us, and there is, it's the other part of it is that it's a trilateral effort, bringing in the Japanese and the United States together in these areas that can focus, and I think, even though it will take a long time, you point out infrastructure doesn't come overnight, but I think it's a lofty goal. But of course, it's important to look around. I think we've talked about that at other areas, regions of the country that can also attract and be important places for American investors. When I've traveled around over the past couple of years, we hear from people in Mindanao and in the Visayas, in Leyte and places. Please come back. So there is a thirst out there for investments, and we'll spread the word on that. And it's important, so not to denigrate that, but the Luzon Economic Corridor makes a lot of sense and is very appealing in many ways.
Dindo?
Yeah, it's very appealing, as Hak said, because it's really created a lot of interest and it creates focus on this trilateral that was announced between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States. And these are areas which we consider, some would say even the Luzon Corridor is what we know in the Philippines as Mega Manila. And in this Mega Manila, it really drives the economy of the Philippines. If we can put more infrastructure investments there and generates more, and this type of investments in infrastructure generates more investment that will create jobs in terms of manufacturing or even growth in the service sector. So then we can say that as we focus our effort, we see some proof of concept and really build on that as we move towards the southern part of the Philippines. So we hope really in the country that something happens in this Luzon corridor.
All right. Thank you very much. We are going to take an 8-minute break for everybody to get recaffeinated, and then we'll come back for our second panel. We're also going to let Dindo get some much-needed rest. But first, please join me in thanking the panel.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Andreka Natalagawa. I'm an associate fellow with the CSIS Southeast Asia Program, and today I will serve as your moderator for the second session of today's event, covering the impact of U.S. investment on the Philippine economy. My desire for this particular session is if the last two sessions, or the last presentation and the last session focused sort of on the 50,000-foot perspective of U.S. Philippines economic relations, I'd like to use this as a platform to dive deeper into what are the impacts of U.S. investment on the Philippine economy writ large, but also in particular sectors, including those outlined in the report that we are publishing today. We've got an all-star panel before you. I will go sort of in order. We have Dr. Alvin Kamba, who is a critical mineral specialist at Associated Universities Incorporated, also a widely published academic in both journals and in media. We have Lilibeth Almonte Arbez, who is a senior director at the U.S. ASEAN Business Council here in Washington, D.C., and we have Ryan Evangelista, who is the Philippines Country Director for the Center for International Private Enterprise. Each of our speakers will deliver brief framing remarks. We'll begin a moderated conversation after that, and then we'll have time for questions from the floor, both from our in-person audience and from our audience online. So if you are online, please feel free to submit questions into the Q&A box on the CSIS website. And with that, I'll turn it over to Alvin.
Okay, well, so good morning. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Greg for inviting me. I'll first start this brief remarks by talking about how I appreciate the report a lot, and I think it's excellent. And for me to contribute really substantively to sort of this conversation, I have to put the skeptics hat on and actually talk about what we can sort of do more moving forward. So I have five ideas about this. I think the premise of the report, which is U.S. investments are underreported and disinformation actors take advantage of this underreporting to sort of vilify the United States, is strong and true. Nonetheless, I am a bit worried that this premise that Greg and CSIS are pushing forward can be hijacked by the same disinformation actors to the detriment of Filipinos. Specifically, if many Filipinos, and I grew up in the Philippines before moving here 15, 16 years ago, many Filipinos are frustrated about economic development. Recently, Vietnam has surpassed the Philippines in GDP per capita. For instance, Vietnam was ravaged by war during in the 70s. And Filipinos have been generally frustrated about economic development in the past, I would say since the 90s, since I was growing up there. People talk about and complain about transportation. You see pictures of the MRT with literally lines of people on the way, in the major highways, and you have issues of rent seeking, etc. So I am worried that the report, in terms of if the U.S. is doing a lot already, but people are unhappy, it gives pro-China groups the ammunition to say that, well, working with the United States is not enough. Perhaps it is time to look for an alternative. That is a potential way that disinformation actors can hijack this report. Not to say the message is initially wrong, but perhaps the message is something that needs to be carried out alongside with really substantive reforms on targeting Philippine economic development, which goes to the second point that I'm making. The U.S. model has done very well in terms of private sector investments. The Philippines is a service sector economy of Southeast Asia. Second to India in terms of BPO investments. Millions of people are employed in the BPO sector. If you look at it from a per population basis, the Philippines is ahead of India in terms of BPO investments. India just has way more people, obviously. Now, I think private investments are good, but sometimes it begs a question of there's a need to go beyond private investments. Perhaps there's a need to sort of create a bigger state initiative that spurs economic growth and targets the Philippines, limited, I would say, the Philippines' potential in terms of creating economic growth for Filipinos. Of course, we've heard about the LEC, the Luzon Economic Corridor, and that's very promising, that's very good. There's a question for me, and again, this is not about the report, but the United States per se. There's a question of speed and expediency of the LEC and how it can be targeted towards a political cycle. So sometime in April, I published a foreign policy article on this, and I've actually talked about how if Sara Duterte wins in 2028, by and large because the Marcos government has been unable to translate its promises into tangible economic growths that can be weaponized into getting votes for Sara. And if Sara wins, knock on wood, if Sara wins, that she may reverse a lot of the progress that has been done positively during the Marcos administration and bring back the second Duterte administration, the horrors of that particular regime. So now, what is my suggestion here? Perhaps beyond the LLC, it's more about, in my view, making sure the LLC is expedient, but more importantly, it targets a key problem in the Philippines. We were talking about U.S. private investments a while ago. Part of my research is I've interviewed investors both from China and the United States. The big problem in the Philippines is really energy costs, more than anything. If you have huge energy costs, it makes transaction costs higher, and it makes economies of scale literally lower. And this has been a big problem with manufacturing investments. Why do they go to Vietnam? Why do they go to Indonesia, etc.? So targeting energy targeting energy is something to think about. And when we think about Chinese investments, generally. The reason why Chinese investments are sellable, in my view, is because of the type of investment that they are making. Usually physical infrastructure, large-scale physical infrastructure, very visible, and the impact of this infrastructure is usually something that affects everybody to some degree. Now, the U.S. and Japan have done great things in terms of physical infrastructure, but I would say there's a need to do more. Japan's subway is super important. That's something that can be hyped up, and of course, the problem with PRC investments is, apart from the criminal issues that emerge from it, online gambling, etc. The main problem with the U.S. investments for me would be we relied so much on private sector, and that may take some time because they actually have to come in and be willing to invest, and it might not be in line with the political cycle that will happen, and therefore people will need to feel that they are gaining from working with the United States, and that's something to think about at least. Okay, I'm going to be brief with my third and fourth and fifth comment, just to finish this quickly. I'm going to put my academic hat on for a little while, so forgive me. The report is great. I would say further reports that look at individual modes of financing, compare FDI to FDI, aid to aid, OOF to OOF is something that the CSIS can do. It's true that we need to look at future U.S. investments, but something that can strengthen the report is to look at investments in the past and compare the United States investments with China temporarily. If you are in need of my services, you know how to contact me. So, I would say. Something I've written in the past is that when POGO investments, online gambling, came in the Philippines, it basically displaced a lot of call center workers. And it was really bad for a lot of Filipinos because, apart from the criminal investments, a lot of BPO workers were literally out of work because the POGOs, the online gambling, took over many of the condominiums that a lot of the BPOs actually occupy. Fourth comment, I completely agree with the report on initiative to strengthen investment data. I would say PSA is good. The problem with Philippine Statistics Authority is they look at approved investments, not actual investments. I would suggest to look at Security Exchange Commission data that really looks at specific investments in the country and sort of the impact there. And my final comment would be, I completely agree with the report regarding socializing commercial relations to ensure the trickle-down effect of investments. That's a super important point. Something that disinformation actors in the Philippines talk about is that the United States admits more Chinese tourists and gives Chinese citizens more visas than Filipinos, despite the friendship of the Philippines and the United States. I would say a regulation or a law by future administrations that ensure potentially visa-free. I don't really benefit from it anymore, but visa-free. But my family members might. So visa-free privileges to other Filipinos, and to sort of create this long-lasting friendship that really affects Filipinos beyond the question of investments and beyond the questions of money. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I'll just note, I feel like you've given us a number of different ideas for a sequel to this report, so that's a productive session that we're having.
Don't forget about me.
Of course, we'll keep you in mind. Lilibeth, turning over to you.
Thank you, Andres. I think when I look at the question, it's the impact of U.S. investment representing over 180 U.S. firms in Southeast Asia. The Council has a unique view to things. And all this to say, regardless of who wins in the White House or who gets elected in the Philippine Senate, next year or a new president in the next 3 years, U.S. companies have long invested in the Philippines since the early days of the modern republic. There are companies who've been there over 100 years, and this report is really a good wake-up call, a reminder to tell their story a little more. We do tell the story of the successes of American firms vis-a-vis, our dialogue with the U.S. government and Philippine officials, but I think the broader story could be better told publicly, and I applaud CSIS. It's a gargantuan effort, and I really enjoyed scrolling the digital content. For our part, we do see 3 important areas in the Philippine economy that benefits from U.S. investment, and U.S. investment broadly, like government-driven, government signaling investment, and also U.S. private sector investment. And these are in 3 areas. First is digital economy, and a part of that really is the physical infrastructure required to fuel that, and that's transportation and logistics, because e-commerce has exploded literally in the country. If you look at Google's e-economy report, the Philippines is, I think, similar to Vietnam, the top digital economy in Southeast Asia in terms of its growth. And that says a lot about a country that's smaller than Indonesia in terms of the uptick of technologies there. Second is U.S. firms play an important role really in what we consider green economy. And what do we mean by this? U.S. firms, when they do invest or decide to do business in a country, more and more they respond to their investors' concerns. And we do see kind of a greening of investor interests. And so a lot of U.S. firms actually drive the demand for renewable energy. So it's not just the Philippine government having to promote a lot of renewable energy projects so that there will be more power generation. A lot of the wind behind that is also U.S. firms saying, okay, if you'd like us to put more data centers, then we'll probably have to work with you better so that we could have more renewable energy in turn so that we could meet our own emissions targets. And that's a very real conversation that's going on between U.S. companies and the Philippine government. And I do want to dispel a false narrative that renewable energy is a tough sector for American investors or for foreign investors. I think it just takes a lot of time for people to understand that the Public Services Act amendment opened this sector. It's only been 2 years, and I know it's kind of hard to shake off some of these older narratives that the sector is closed, that the conglomerates are all over it. No, this is among the sectors that was opened up, including telecoms, and I do invite people to kind of support both governments' efforts in looking at specific sectors and try not to, I guess, reiterate the false narratives behind kind of older, I guess, the older regime of foreign ownership restrictions. And I think the third economy that we think would be kind of a newer area is actually U.S. and Philippine government directed. Most recently, Philippine government, and this is the creation of a defense economy. 3 weeks ago, President Marcos signed the self-reliant Defense Posture Revitalization Act, and while that has a lot of language on promoting local industry, the rationale behind this legislation is really to complement the foreign acquisition of the Philippine government and create local industry behind it. And we know that this is an important step because in the Philippines, for Philippines watchers, and I grew up there, certainly there's this fear that the alliance, is not an equal one. And therefore, the Philippines will just keep on buying and then, there's no economic benefit to the country. And this is a concerted, it's a good move, I think, on the Philippine government's part to really put this strategy at the forefront. And we can actually start talking about a development plan and how to include foreign participants in building that industry. So I will pause there, and certainly could go on and on. What does U.S. investment do? The upskilling, the job creation and the technology transfer. But let me pause there and give Ryan a few more minutes to speak. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And what I'm hearing is the Philippines is a fascinating story in the sense that U.S. investment, it sounds to me that U.S. investment has been there for quite some time and has been concentrated in industries that are traditional parts of the economy, but you're also seeing this investment in newer sectors of the economy, including digital services, including green energy. So it's a really multifaceted relationship is what I'm hearing. I'll turn it over to Ryan to close out this initial remarks.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to thank CSIS, Craig, Japheth, and the team for the kind invitation to be here. Again, it's a very interesting report that you wrote, very groundbreaking, a lot of interesting findings, but also I applaud you for putting a very good narrative and discussion points on a complex economy like ours. And indeed, even as a Filipino myself, we've been trying to kind of understand the layers of the issues on FDIs in general, but more so our relationship with the United States of America. One important note that I'd like to emphasize in answering the question, the impact of U.S. investments in the Philippines, I would say it's been transformative. We've been through ups and downs, as mentioned earlier, a lot of cycles of development, but also a lot of cycles of political dynamics, and now turning to geopolitical landscape and issues around that cycle. It's important to note that I think that the U.S.-Philippines relationship has stood the test of times because of our long-standing commitment and unique cooperation that is anchored on goals for economic stability and prosperity. And indeed, it represents promoting democratic values for economic growth throughout the region. In maintaining the strength of this alliance between the two countries, it's crucial. And again, the alliance itself is a testament to how we can build regional stability, resilience of democracy in the region, and market reforms. Our economic partnership, and I'd like to emphasize the value of our bilateral relationship from an economic and investment standpoint, and that is through our Trade and Investment Framework Agreement signed in 1989, which I think until today is an important mechanism that is used to look at the value of consultation, the value of cooperation, and the value of being part of the same table in terms of discussing the future of both economies and how we can cooperate and further strengthen this cooperation. Under the evolving landscape throughout the years that we've signed the TIFA, for example, since 1989, this has expanded to a range of issues and cooperation that includes agriculture and labor rights, intellectual property, procurement, supply chains. This reflects indeed the value and the depth of our economic ties. And I think with now transitioning to IPEF and the bigger context for economic cooperation, it is important that our cooperation mirrors the value of enabling and promoting constructive capital. And that is within emphasizing transparency, accountability, market orientation, aligning with our development goals, fostering innovation, creating jobs, and building a future for a more secured and prosperous cooperation and region. By underscoring the value of responsible capital that the two countries, I think, should solidify furthermore, we're able to attract investments that are really enhancing transparency and accountability in different forms, but also promoting labor rights, supporting innovation in our key sectors, such as agriculture and food security, and protecting intellectual property in a conducive, high stakes and value of investments. I'd like to emphasize that having seen and being part of the trade community with Lilibet and Alvin, actually, I've known Lilibet for a long time in our foreign ministry. I think that the U.S. investment has helped us also transform not just the economic landscape, but the regulatory processes. We have a very complicated regulatory process, and sometimes it distracts rather attract investments. But part of the learning curve is to understand that in doing reforms and market-oriented reforms, we're learning from the big economies like the U.S. For example, in the recent years, we're able to pass our Philippine Competition Act, a long-standing advocacy. I was in the chamber for a long time. It took a long time to understand how the Competition Act would really help solidify the kind of investment environment that we can create. And we've looked into, other competition laws such as the US and EU. And I think this has helped us really inform us better of the quality of regulatory choices that we make for the country, as well as the kind of investments that we want to generate for our economies to flourish. Along those lines as well, we've improved our tariff and customs modernization process, signed off to the WTO trade facilitation agreement. We have signed up or passed the Ease of Doing Business law, which created the Anti-Red Tape Authority, among others. And the last of the series of reform packages came with the PSA amendments, the Philippine Service Act amendments, including the tax reform amendments. All this help us underscore the value of the cooperation because we're learning from the U.S. from the U.S. regulatory mechanisms, as well as how to improve the quality of an investment regime that we hope to offer to the country or to the investors in the country. Part of what I think is an important leverage now and vehicle for the quality of relationship that we have harnessed over the years is how the Philippines has learned as well how to look at quality of investments, but also diversifying our dependence on other economies like China. True enough, the value of our relationship with the U.S. has helped us aligned with better choices in terms of looking at the kind of economy that we want to develop, but also position in terms of both creating reputational value, but also ensuring that investments do harness the quality of lives of the communities that it should serve. And in that regard, I think our relationship with the U.S., particularly in the current geopolitical standpoint, help us now navigate the complexity of dealing with a bigger player, but more complex player and neighbor like China. I'd like to emphasize a couple of points that were highlighted in the study, particularly in the recommendations, which I think evolves further in terms of our understanding of how this relationship can further deepen amidst the cycles of growth and opportunities, but also the challenges that we're facing. For example, on recommendations 1, 2, and 3, it is indeed important to highlight the impact of U.S. investments in the Philippines from various investment agencies under a consolidated and comprehensive database. I truly agree with that. I've dealt with many of these data points in the past and until currently. This necessitates actually improvement in sharing of information between government agencies. We have several dozens of investment promotion offices, but part of that is the need to link, but also ensure that they're able to do robust data mining and analysis, applying the discipline and practice of information sharing among each other. But also, government needs to align its practices and policies working with the private sector and the academe in mining the data and ensuring that availability of information creates a robust cycle for analytics and academic studies, therefore create more credible and evidence-based information that encourage more investments in the country. Part of what I see, and this is the work that we're doing with USAID at the moment, is to help strengthen to the level the quality of investment facilitation and programs within the local government units. In the Philippines, and all our local government units have their own local investment or local economic investment promotion offices. We're doing a massive training program for those offices that are under a USAID program that we are working with. And part of the shortage of gap that I see is that a lot of these LEDIPOs are not equipped to work with the likes of Board of Investments, as well as other agencies, national agencies on investment promotion, to really look at the data points and see the value, as well as the importance of linking them together in terms of sectoral development and growth should be emphasized further. On recommendation 4, I agree that there needs to be more robust area of cooperation to address this information, particularly in relation to economic security. Part of the bigger narrative that needs to play out in local representation in the Philippines is how U.S. investments value and reinforce reinforce and respect sovereignty, promote fair and free trade based on transparent rules, and ensure freedom from economic coercion. For example, PGII's vision and goals and methodology promoting transparent and accountable investments in infrastructure contrast that of the Belt and Road initiatives. And there needs to be more popularization and socialization of PGI and the benefits from the different infrastructure programs that are currently being onboarded. On recommendations 5 and 6, I agree that building a more exchanges and missions in both countries can help leverage the position of the Philippines and U.S. in as far as aligning in terms of interests from different sectors and continue targeting sectors of interest. One important dimension of promoting investment diversification, it was asked earlier by our ambassador, is the need to look at secondary cities in the country. And that's what I'm going to allude to in the work that we're doing with USAID right now. We're part of a project called Urban Connect, where we work with USAID in cities in Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao to support inclusive and resilient economic growth in secondary cities. And this include Batangas, Legazpi, Puerto Princesa, in Luzon, in Visayas, Iloilo, Tacloban, and Tagbilaran, and in Cagayan de Oro, and in Mindanao, Cagayan de Oro, General Santos, and Zamboanga. What does it mean, actually? What does this program do? For example, as a representative of SIPE in the project, I've done 9 assessments of the enabling environment for investments of the 9 cities. Completed the assessments last September with a 9-month time frame. What we're learning from this assessment is that there are opportunities for the secondary cities to absorb investments and connect them to the bigger corridors, such as the ones that we're doing with the Luzon Economic Corridor. The caveat is the need to emphasize the value of what regulatory quality and regulatory mechanisms should play out in ensuring that investments, when they come into the country and in these regions, in the cities, they're actually supported and enabled. The important layer of discussions, I think, need to happen between the national government and local government in helping each other accelerate the foundations for effective governance framing to help investments be able to evolve, but also ensure that the right investments are coming into the country and to the regions. In the work that we're doing with Urban Connect and USAID, what we're trying to emphasize is that in building a conducive investment environment, we also need to ensure that we're attracting the right investments and ensuring that these investments really value the landscape and the opportunities that are accorded to them. In the end, I think that investments from the U.S. has indeed helped us transition the economy moving forward, but also helped us attract more quality investments outside the U.S. by demonstrating confidence in our market, supporting infrastructure, and ensuring that our regulatory environment and reforms and improvements do actually are positioned well, that they are not just an afterthought when investments come in, but they are actually positioned well enough to ensure that investments are supported when they come to the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I just want to hone in on Ryan's discussion about recommendations 1 through 3 in our report, the ones on information transparency, information sharing as it relates to investment data, because my perspective is that this is something that's beneficial to a multitude of groups. It's helpful for academics like us here at CSIS. It makes our research easier in terms of understanding the U.S. investment relationship with the Philippines, but it also helps the government make decisions and be informed about the decisions it's making. And it helps the Philippine public in terms of being aware of the investment that's coming into the country and holding actors accountable for that. So it's something that is in our report, and we will talk about at length as well. So we've got about 25 minutes on the clock. I have a couple of questions prepared, and if folks have questions, you're welcome to line up at the microphone or submit questions through our online form, and we'll get to those. But I want to kick off maybe first with a question for Alvin. In your remarks, you noted that some of the momentum and movement that we've seen in the U.S. Philippines investment relationship and economic relationship is, in some ways subject to political calendars and political dynamics. So I guess my question here is, what can the United States and the Philippines do to institutionalize some of this positive momentum and insulate it from those shifts that happen as they do in democracies and democratic countries like the Philippines and the United States? What can we do to safeguard those aspects of the relationship?
Okay, well, so thank you for the question. So the United States and U.S. investments have been very good at channeling capital towards sectors that are already productive, and that generates a lot of positive economic contribution to the country. For instance, the service sector, business process outsourcing, and there are efforts right now towards diversifying the ways these capitals are sort of diverted in the country. And that's what Ryan said. The U.S. has been very good at ensuring regulatory quality. Improving regulation that sort of insulates, that makes it easier for private sector to sort of come in and for more investments to come in. Now, for me, the big issue with the U.S. economic model is many government efforts are oriented towards reducing private sector transaction costs. So this would be a lot of what we do in US, a lot of what my colleagues do at I don't work with USAID, but I just refer to my colleagues there. USAID, the MMC, even the development finance, corporation to some degree. Even if we sort of implement projects that reduce private sector transaction, it is ultimately the decision of the private sector whether they're going to come in or not. If it's profitable, they're going to come in. If it's not profitable, then they're not going to come in. My main suggestion here would be we need an initiative, whether it's a state-oriented project, a major state-oriented project from the United States, and Japan is doing a lot of this, that creates large-scale physical infrastructure that directly impacts the economy and reduces the economies of scale to ensure manufacturing investments to come in. And then this to me is a more, I would say, long-lasting, permanent, long-term goal that would probably lock in, I would say, problematic, nefarious political actors like the Dutertes, and would actually ensure that they will not reverse any potential gains from this relationship. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And so I'll turn my next question to Lilibeth and Ryan, each of you to chew on. I feel like you've both highlighted in your remarks some of the narrative challenges around the reforms that the Philippine government has undertaken in recent years, and the public perception of the Philippines as a viable destination for investment not quite sort of catching up to where these reforms currently are. And so my question is, what can the Philippines and countries like the United States do in terms of helping to socialize some of the massive changes that are taking place right now in the Philippines with both the Filipino audience, but also audiences internationally?
Thank you, Andreas. I think my observation was premised on the fact that despite a lot of good work on both the U.S. government side and the Philippine government side, whether at HQ or at embassies abroad, they list down these are the sectors that are open. It's black and white, and yet the perception is not changed. And I think it's really just constant education and awareness and explanation. And so for like this, when you have a chance to dispel or to correct a perception is key. And certainly your report is a good way of visibly showing what these sectors are able to do. And there are specific U.S. company examples, which is for us, of course, for the council, all of them are members, or if not 90%. It's a good way to show and tell their story. That's one. But there is, I think, room for, I guess, beyond the messaging within the bilateral conversations, the G2G, to kind of bring in more, not just U.S. private sector, but their local partners, and the democracy sector in the Philippines. And these are your nonprofits who operate in labor, in environment, to just include them in the conversation, because we understand the advocacy posture they take, but they may not, and they are heard in various channels, but they may not necessarily be the ones, staying on top of trade policy, the recent reforms, the recent tax incentives, etc. And so I think it's certainly a communications challenge, but it requires that broader strategy, I feel. Thank you.
I echo what Lilibet mentioned. As an organization affiliated with the U.S. Chamber, we work closely with different associations, business associations, and I think on the front and center of all the benefits for investments and economic development is really the private sector that creates and enables the engine for growth. But at the same time, not to forget and not to neglect the value of cooperating with the civil society organizations such as the academe, which provides a very independent analysis and can broker discussions. Part of the bigger, I think, challenge at the moment in the Philippines is that we need to really emphasize the quality of such reform programs that came about because of the growing interest and investments that are coming from the U.S. And I think this is something that sometimes a lot of individuals in the public mainstream tend to forget, unless we see in the headlines that the pogos are the Chinese pogos are doing this and have social ramifications in our economy, and then we only think about compare Pogo with another U.S. investor like Texas Instrument, who's been in the country for decades and has helped propel, Baguio and the rest of Luzon to its rightful, place as a manufacturing hub for tech companies like that. I think, short of saying, I don't think that the U.S. companies themselves would like to be in the spotlight by sharing news and information about what they're doing, what have they done, because it will be self-serving. It would be a disadvantage as well for many of them. But I think what needs to be done is the cycle of continuing efforts to share information and use this information to look at studies like the ones that you have done, and then make sure that the studies are articulated in a way that we see the difference of quality investments vis-a-vis investments that do not define who we are as a country and who we are as a democracy. So I think those are important narratives that need to be discussed further.
All right, thank you. So I'll ask one more question of the group before heading into audience questions. One of the findings that I think Japhet raised during the presentation earlier is that a lot of the economic activity and investment still tends to be concentrated around Metro Manila. When you're looking at U.S. investment and foreign investment broadly in the Philippines. So my question is, what steps can the United States government take to support the private sector, the U.S. private sector, in expanding its footprint throughout the Philippines? It's a large country, 7,000 islands, as Japhet noted, and there are lots of areas that are being underserved by this economic relationship, or there's potential in that arena. And so my question again is what can the United States government do to support for the private sector on this front?
So just very quick, of course, the reason why these investments are concentrated in Metro Manila and Central Luzon is it is the most productive part of the country. So money will go where money actually can be made. Now, I think this has already been mentioned in the report, but also by my colleagues here, that we need programs that sort of foster, I would say, like regionally oriented sort of programs that target like specific regions in the Philippines. But I think something even more is that there are a lot of like Filipino groups here that are regionally like oriented, and sort of capitalizing on Filipino groups that are Ilocanos, Bicolanos, Visayas, etc. is an opportunity to foster what Ryan was talking about as private civil society based organizations, and sort of like centering that in terms of what the United States has and can do. Going back to like remittances and sort of the money that Filipinos bring back, and creating these relationships. It's I'm an academic. Sometimes it's hard to talk about like answers that with like very concrete like outcomes. But I would, generally speaking, that's what I would like think about.
Just briefly, there are economic corridors that may have been glossed over in the big announcement, right? Because everyone talks about the Luzon economic corridor, but that doesn't mean there are other parts of the country where there's no economic corridors, or that U.S. companies don't operate outside Luzon. But for sure, 70% of GDP is produced in Luzon, and of course the profit incentive to stay in that area makes sense because it's just easier and faster. However, we do know that U.S. companies in tech are in Iloilo, Cebu, Davao, Cagayan de Oro, and Zamboanga City. And coming from Mindanao, it certainly warms my heart when my former colleague, Ambassador Colonge, pointed it out that there's really a need to broaden the base. And it's not just physical infrastructure, it's the digital divide as well. In fact, the faster rollout might be through digital financial services because, the demographic of the Philippines is really, young, 25 mobile mobile phone users, and so that would be an area that might get faster traction than doing the big projects, right? Big projects are important, but they take a really awful long time. I think the last big project was Samar Leyte, connecting the two islands, and then now there's I think the opening of Pangil Bay, which is in northern Mindanao, and these are big infrastructure projects that the Philippine government now funds with ODA partners like Japan. Right? It does take a while. But then you could also think like small demonstration, which is smart cities. And the U.S. government, to a certain degree, has succeeded in its smart cities program in ASEAN. So it's identified 4 cities in every country, and it's got U.S. city partnerships, and it's specific to transport. And I know not everyone kind of gets urban mobility, etc. But those are, I guess, valuable projects in demonstrating the impact of a strategic relationship.
I definitely agree. And to add to what Alvin and Lilibet mentioned, I think when we look at the PGI and the Luzon corridor, and in the Philippines, when we discussed this among colleagues in the economic sector, this is definitely an opportunity to scale the economic corridor into a different dimension and bring it to the Visayas and Mindanao. And I think there are certainly opportunities along those lines. And I think the likes of USA, the likes of other agencies, the agencies in the country are looking at that as a dimension. But one important element, I think, that we need to seek further cooperation and strengthen the viability of the secondary cities, apart from infrastructure, which is very common and traditional as the narrative or issues that we need to address, is the quality of supply chains in the areas. We need to strengthen the supplier development tracks in secondary cities and look at them not just a one-off kind of opportunity for a company, but more like mobilizing, I think, regional approaches. Outside, for example, Mindanao, a lot of work is currently supporting Mindanao for the many reasons, because not just of the peace and the economic transition that's happening in the region, particularly in the Bangsamoro region, but also because Mindanao has a lot of rich resources that we haven't tapped yet. But one consideration is the need to strengthen the supplier, development and aggregation in the region. But looking at Mindanao, not just as a part of the Philippine Island Distribution Group, but part of BIMPIAGA, the Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, corridor. And that, I think, is an opportunity for investors to see the country as a jumping point, to look at the regional context and the opportunities within the region, ASEAN itself, but the sub-regional alliances such as BIMPIAGA offer. That's one context, I think, in the value proposition. As I mentioned earlier, the deepened work, or the more important work, needs to happen within the context of supporting local governments, because investments do not end where BOIs, or the likes of BOI, the likes of PESA, just sign off. They need to go through the regulatory regimes, file a business permit, get a mayor's clearance, go through all this extensive process that's sometimes unfriendly. And this is where I think we can leverage the local economic investment promotion offices as advocates, rather just plain and simple processors of information or permits, but they can become advocates to help mobilize and institutionalize streamlined regulatory practices across different local government units, because they can be arbitrary in different local governments, so to speak.
All right, thank you. So I'll turn it over to the in-person Q&A. If there are folks who have a question to ask, feel free to step up to the mic. And would you mind identifying yourself, your affiliation as well? Thank you.
Yes. My name is Carson Keller. I am an intern with the Missile Defense Program here at CSIS, with an interest in what's going on at this event today. My question, which is kind of a general question, is that with the passing of the Self-Reliance Defense Posture Law, what specifically can U.S. investment do to help jumpstart local Philippine defense industries in the sector as a whole?
Thank you. Maybe I'll toss it over to Lilibeth.
Thank you for the question. We have U.S. firms that are experienced in working with local partners in building, defense capacity in other countries. So that would be a good starting point for the Philippine government to engage actors like that in co-developing a development plan. Usually, what the Philippine government does when it, puts together a development plan, there's this huge interagency effort, and it's mostly internal, and our advocacy and our success so far with the Philippine government is to really allow more private sector input in developing these plans, because you cannot build industry without private sector unless you're sure of your 35 billion budget like in 10 years. That's safeguarded, right? And so the planning has to start out right, but the law itself has a good framework of engaging innovation councils, academia, so that it's not just an AFP modernization checklist. And so, but it will be a huge effort, and as with all development plans, it takes a while to put things on paper. But that would be, I think, our contribution, U.S. private sector contribution in developing the plan. And hopefully it will be open.
All right, thank you. So as folks if you have any questions, again, feel free to head up to the mic. I want to take a moment to maybe pick up on something that I think a few of you have mentioned earlier, but some of the initiatives that the Biden administration has introduced over the course of initiatives like IPEF, but also some of the bilateral developments in the U.S. Philippines economic relationship have centered on this notion of upskilling. Right, and in particular in terms of digital skills, as an example. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the role that the United States can play, not just in investment, but also specifically human capital investment and upskilling folks in the Philippines. Just curious if you have any thoughts on what more we can do on that front.
This was a question that a senior economic advisor of the Philippines asked our organization. And so to respond to his question, we put together a list. Okay, what are U.S. companies doing in upskilling, their Philippine workforce? And it's maybe the numbers don't reach the millions because IPEF, lists for the region. But for the Philippines, it's up to 100,000, and that was middle of this year. And so what we see is, U.S. firms do not wait for the government kind of skilling programs. They have their respective programs in spanning, basic financial literacy, professional skills to AI, cloud computing, and analytics. And so we see that as a very active area of upskilling, but again, driven mostly by digital economy. And the Philippines is really at the forefront within ASEAN in that sense, owing because of the, I guess, better partnership with the tripartite partnership. And this is what we hope we could really scale a bit more in ASEAN. To Ryan's point, you don't look at the Philippines only as the lone kind of country in the middle of the Pacific. It sits, not just in these controversial sea lanes and, for open and free trade, but it is at the core also of ASEAN as a founding member. And so a lot of the work that the Philippines is doing is actually more with ASEAN than the United States. If you look at all the bilateral trade policy and regional trade policy, at the core of the government work is really concentrated in ASEAN and the ASEAN partners. And we are certainly glad that the Biden administration elevated that partnership with ASEAN so that it's become strategic, and Secretary Blinken and the Vice President had gone out to the region and really put together more deliberate effort to be present in the region. And we see the Philippines continue to play that critical role when it heads the ASEAN chairmanship in 2026. So that's another way of, to your initial question, how do you election-proof something? And certainly we hope the bureaucracy and the private sector would keep the wheels going.
I always feel like I'm the naysayer in this room. Completely agree with the previous point. I would simply add that when we do upskill, and I think this is a little bit lacking, it has to be connected to some long-term economic goal that's connected to structural transformation of the economy beyond from a service sector, BPO center, remittance center country to some, we're doing this right away in manufacturing, but something that pushes the country way more. And having this long-term goal is super important, so you don't have administration transition that changes these goals depending on their political cup of tea.
And to that point, I really agree. I'd just like to highlight a couple of points in relation to what Lilibet and Alvin mentioned, because this is a very important track of what we see in terms of actual benefits, particularly with the supply chain resilience programs and CHIPS Act, for example. There are two important elements that I think needs to be unpacked in the process. One is the upskilling of the current workforce in the semiconductors and technology sector, but also upskilling of the quality of suppliers within the value chain of the sectors themselves. So one, I think we need to fully utilize some of our laws in the Philippines. We have a competency standard framework that's not yet been fully utilized. It's now being utilized because of these developments. Lilibet mentioned about the innovation hubs that are currently being funded more and more thoroughly, so we're very happy with that. But also, I think we should not forget that we need to transform the quality of business activities from the micro, small, and medium enterprises who are part of the ecosystem, technology ecosystem. In that regard, part of our initiative, we're working with USAID on another project called SPEED, Strengthening Private Enterprise in the Digital Economy, and developing a roadmap. This would address what Alvin mentioned, a national digital transformation roadmap that would help seize the opportunities for SMEs, but also make them viable suppliers and players in the supply chain for technology industry, whether it's in the AI sector or in the semiconductor development sectors. So I think this has to form, what I think needs to happen is that government, private sector, civil society, labor community needs to really deepen the collaboration, but also ensure that we're not just looking at 1 to 2 years, but more importantly, the next 50 years, the next 20 years of the transition, whether our economy will be anchored in purely, production and in the manufacturing sense of semiconductors anchored on assembly, rather producing the actual chips and where we are in that supply chain. So that's part of the bigger, I think, intention, and hopefully we're going to get there a few years from now.
All right, well, thank you. I've been informed that we are officially over time, so I'll have to close this out, this discussion out, but want to thank all of our panelists here today, both the second session and the first session. I would also like to thank the United States Global Engagement Center for their support for this project, and I have also been informed that the report is now live on the CSIS website, so please feel free to go on your phones and check it out. Thank you very much.